And we planted this grad fellowship, and I remember the time we asked Terry to come and speak, because he came, and at that time we were probably 25 to 30 students. He came and had cut out articles from the New York Times, and then got us into groups and gave us each an article and said, so how do you think Christianly about this article? And they were articles on music and science and politics and anything you can kind of find in the New York Times. And it blew our minds. Because back then we were at the very beginning of GFM, and we were like, I don't know, music? I mean, it was just very random. It felt like, what? And yet that was energizing and exciting, and it actually launched us as a fellowship into beginning the work on integration, which back then was a little bit more of a pipe dream, I think, of what will this actually be something we do. So Terry is the one who started our fellowship off with that and has been a huge friend to InterVarsity ever since, and so John is going to tell us more.
And knowing Terry as I do, that story rings very true. It sounds exactly like something he would do. So Terence Halliday studied at Massey University in New Zealand and the University of Toronto before completing a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. I'll come back to that University of Chicago thing. They don't give out PhDs in sociology just for fun. Terry is a specialist in globalization and law at the American Bar Foundation. He focuses on globalization of markets and politics with particular attention to global norm-making by international organizations. Halliday co-directs the Center on Law and Globalization at the ABF. He is an adjunct professor of sociology at Northwestern University and honorary professor at the School of Regulation, Justice, and Diplomacy, the Faculty of Asia and the Pacific, Australia National University. His research regularly takes him to China, where he meets with human rights lawyers under some extraordinary circumstances given the current political climate. That is Terry's day job. Terry's calling also extends to other interests. I first heard of Terry via his work with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, as he partnered with Vivinath Ramachandra in conversations in different parts of the world, helping the IFES think about the university seriously as an institution, not just a place to work with students and faculty. We had the opportunity to host Terry at the University of Wisconsin, where he presented his work and delivered a challenge to the UW Law School. He brought with him a lawyer from China, Zhang Kai, who works in human rights law. That visit has left a lasting impression on a number of the faculty and students I work with. Now, as I said, they don't give away PhDs in sociology at the University of Chicago. That's a very storied department within the university. Now, while visiting UW, Terry asked if we could sit down over a cup of coffee so he could ask me about what I was doing in GFM and engaging the university. And I thought, great, somebody wants to treat me to a cup of coffee finally. This is wonderful. I've been on staff for 26 years, and I'd like to think I'm pretty good at getting faculty and students to open up about their lives over a cup of coffee. I am not used to having the tables turned on me. But at Aldo's Cafe, I had the signal experience of having a University of Chicago trained sociologist ask me question after question after question, probing me about why we do what we do and how we do it, peeling off layer after layer of supposed understanding about my own job. When the subject of our Mundelein meetings came up, Salt and Light, engaging the university in presence and conversation, I could think of no one better to speak to us than Terry. So please help me welcome Terry Halliday.
Thank you very much, Kathy and John. I'm delighted that other people have memories. And you'll notice, John, that I didn't invite you for more than coffee, only coffee. Next time we'll have dinner. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. I've partnered with so many of you in various forums, the Ohio Valley group, thanks Bob for that inspiring story, with the Midwest Grad Faculty Ministry, more recently in Northern California. And I've learned from many of you as we've discussed things together in Krakow at the World Assembly of the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and then most recently at the World Assembly in Mexico City in 2015, where a number of you attended, and it was an exciting time that we had together. Today I'm wearing a sort of three hats simultaneously. My first is, as John suggested, is as a volunteer with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, where Vinod Ramachandra, a theologian from Sri Lanka, and I are seeking to spearhead a movement we call Engaging the University. IVCF, for those of you who don't know, is sort of an umbrella movement of the 160 or 170 national student movements across the world. As John has suggested, my day job is as a scholar, where I specialize in globalization and law, so my everyday interlocutors are graduate students and faculty. So I feel right at home here. But I feel especially at home here because we are fellow laborers. We have a common vision, and we have a common mission field. And by working together is a way in which we can enlarge God's kingdom and revitalize the university in the kinds of exciting ways that Bob has just been describing. I'm passionate about this issue because in a way it rehearses my own autobiography. When I grew up in a wonderful Christian home, but in a very narrow understanding of the faith. And when I went off to university, it was an emancipatory experience. InterVarsity was very strong in New Zealand at the time. And I learned there were multiple ways to interpret the Bible. And all of scholarship potentially had something to say to my Christian understandings, and my Christian understandings had something to say to scholarship. When I came to the University of Chicago, it was a very exciting place, and one of the first things I did was go to the Christian group on campus. I discovered that group had nothing to do with the university. That group was replicating what my local church did. All the great ideas I was struggling with and hearing all around the quadrangles day after day never penetrated the Christian group. So I never went back. And in fact, for many years I led a bifurcated life, as so many academics do. Working hard as a scholar, doing the kinds of things that Kathy was just mentioning, biblical exposition, something that I love to do, but never did the twain meet. And it was only until a number of years ago that a group of Christian brothers, professors, theologians, and we formed a small group. And they had the temerity to ask me what my actual research projects had to do with my faith. It was splendid, because not only could they ask the questions that I should have been asking myself, they could also help me with the answers. And for me, that was absolutely thrilling. So that when I said to my group of friends, I'm working on the anti-money laundering and terrorism with the International Monetary Fund, does this have anything to do with the Christian faith? And it was a somewhat genuine question. Well, these people all lifted a couple of inches in their chairs and off they went. And at the end of that hour, I had inspiration and I had some direction. And so through this, I developed something of a fresh call. So I'm passionate about our role in the United States and the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students across the world to deepen our ministry to the whole university. We need to be called to speak to individuals and for individual lives to be transformed. We must also, I believe, embrace the entire university as an institution, a fallen institution, a distinctive institution, but an institution that can be redeemed through the grace of God and through our work with the graduate students and faculty who are there. Many IFES movements talk about the number of students they win for Christ, and that's entirely appropriate. I have a great burden about all of those students we lose from Christ. All of those Christian students who come to university, as I went to the University of Chicago, and they're expecting something exciting, some relationship between their faith, and they don't get it, and they go away. And I'm thinking of all of those other students who might be open to the claims of the gospel, to the insight of our scriptures, to the great theologies that have developed over the last 2,000 years, and they never hear it. And indeed, they don't even know that Christians are intelligent about these matters. And so they never bother to engage in conversations with us. So I would like to reiterate what was in the reading I gather that was sent out before our time at this meeting. we see at least 4 different approaches to ministry in the university. One is what we call a pietistic or a devotional approach. A second is an evangelistic approach. A third is an apologetic approach. And all of these have an important place and must be advanced. But what we are seeking to do in a new paradigm is to develop what we call a dialogical approach for the whole university. And I understand that last night Denise Thompson talked about university leadership and university administration. Today I would like to concentrate on something that's close to what I do 60 or 70 hours a week, and that is the teaching and the research core of the university. That is to say, where students are actually spending 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, reading textbooks, in classrooms, in laboratories, in seminar rooms, at fieldwork sites. Faculty are writing articles, they're thinking about books, they're reviewing books, they're going to conferences, they're writing reports. This is the stuff of university life. And if I were a sociologist, and I was trying to describe this institution, I would say this is the heart of what this institution is about. And if this is our calling, we must be speaking to this call. We must speak to this heart of the institution. I speak to you today from 3 premises that I'll discuss quickly. One is, God is everywhere in the university. At the University of Chicago a couple of years ago, Vinos Ramachandra was speaking. Vinos is both a theologian and a physicist. And the student said in the question time, how do we bring Christ to the university? And Ramachandra most provocatively said, you don't need to bring Christ to the university. God is everywhere in the university. God is already in the laboratories and the classrooms. God is already in the studies of faculty and in the student center. What you need to do is to show those people in the university how and where God is working amongst you. I've been thinking so much about that ever since. In a way, it had never quite crossed my mind, even though this is where I've been working for 40 years. But Ramachandra had in mind, I think, working out general revelation, Psalm 19, the first few verses of Psalm 19. He had in mind, I think, doctrines of common grace and the way in which they are worked through in the university. And I see that my slides are hurrying me along here. So I'll make my second point right along here. Kathy, are you responsible for this? No, all right. I want to emphasize that universities are a distinct site for ministry. That is so obvious, one would think. But I believe that often we treat universities as if they are no different from the local church. Universities are very special places in our society. They are often protected places. They're places where knowledge is developed, where often some of the most fundamental criticisms as well as creative breakthroughs are made. These institutions require a very special ministry tailored to that very special purpose of the university. And we speak to a group of people who are very, very tiny and specialized slice of society. Graduate students and faculty, people who've got very special gifts. Surely we need to be addressing our ministry to the very specialized gifts that those people have. I think here of the metaphors of this conference, which are splendid, from the Beatitudes on light and salt. I love this metaphor of salt. Well, I love food, so salt is a good start. What does salt do? Salt is something that enhances flavor. So whatever I'm eating, with more salt in the right proportions, I get more flavor. Isn't that our calling into the university? So much is going on. God is working in so many ways, known and unknown. Part of our calling is to add the salt that gives it the special flavor. So if we add these 3 things together, I think the ministry that we represent in this room is an extraordinarily important ministry. The university is an extraordinarily important place in the 21st century and in all societies. And we have a very special gift, and the question is how to develop that gift. I'm going to focus today, as I said, on the university and conversation. And I'm going to move quickly, but I'm very happy to share my slides and hopefully later this video with those who are concerned. So what is a conversation? In the first place, a conversation is an exchange. It's something that goes back and forth. And inherent in a conversation is inquisitiveness. I want to know something about you, about what you're thinking, about what something means that you know something about. A conversation is an expression of wonder. How does that work? What's going on in your mind? What's that new idea that you've come up with? And not least for those of us who are Christians, a conversation is a relation-building experience, because the very mutuality built into a conversation requires a back and a forth. This is at the heart of our relational gospel, at the heart of Jesus and his work and teaching. A conversation is not a lecture, a monologue to a passive audience, which is we as academics are so skilled at doing. It's not a debate. We're not fighting for points. It's not a diatribe denouncing somebody for this or that. And neither, dare I say, is it a sermon. A conversation is something intrinsic to the university. It's very organic. It's entirely non-threatening, or should be, and non-judgmental. It has an egalitarian spirit built into it. It's a superb way for us to be in the university and part of the university and to be accepted as such. That's why I was so delighted to see the Acts 17 study that we have done this morning. I find it helpful to think of conversations as Christian virtue in a couple of different ways. To sustain a conversation properly, I think, requires Christian virtues. Humility, because I am saying, you know something that I don't know. I place myself in an inferior position from the outset. It's encouraging because I'm saying you know something that I don't know. I'm encouraging you to tell me about something that you're authoritative in or that you're particularly interested in. Conversations require patience. They can be extremely frustrating and extremely annoying. I'm slow to learn, you're slow to learn, whoever it is in the conversation doesn't quite get it. So there can be many iterations. It's a mutual experience. It encourages mutuality, which I think is one of the social interactions at the heart of our gospel, which inspires exchange. And not least, it endows dignity. It gives respect. I really want to know what you are thinking about. I want to hear your ideas. I want to know what experiment you're working on. I want to know what your current research is focused on. I might even go a step further and suggest to us that conversations might be thought of as a proving ground for developing our own godliness as graduate students, or as faculty, or as staff workers. So let us talk quickly and inadequately about the disciplinary focus of the university. I had the terrific experience recently of being at the Northern California Winter Conference, thanks to our wonderful friends who are here, and it was a splendid time together. And so as part of the conference, we asked the students, they sort of spanned the university faculty, so that was splendid in itself, and we asked the students to nominate a whole series of issues that are hot topics in their field. If we're going to engage the core of the university, what is the core of the university? Well, for engineers, the biosciences, we see it has to do with gene editing and intellectual property, trying to turn biological techniques into property, or how we're treating our lab animals. The engineers talk about sustainability and energy and water conservation, and how we find answers to those. The electrical and chemical engineers are thinking about deep neural networks. If only we had time, I would have loved to have found out what those are. Artificial intelligence and virtual reality. And in fact, they ask a fundamental ethical and therefore theological question: is technological advancement beneficial? The computer people, of course, are thinking about human-computer interactions and strong artificial intelligence, but also our own limits. I saw some of you have probably been watching that competition between the Apple computer and the great Go champion of the world over these last few days. A very interesting case in point. The humanities people, certainly at the bottom, thinking about systemic oppression and the way this is reflected in literature and philosophy, such as the discussion of inequality that Bob was talking about coming up at Ohio State. As a social scientist, these questions are absolutely right on point, because these are exactly the kinds of issues that we are debating across the social science disciplines and across the world. Who are our conversation? One final slide here. The physicists and the earth science people, there was lots of talk about climate change and what we can do about it, how we can reduce emissions. This bottom activity in Northern California, the ground's constantly moving there apparently. So seismic activity was on their minds. In fact, somebody came up with a brilliant idea I'd love to share at some stage about a series that you could have in the university on stress. So I was instantly thinking of my psyche. They were thinking about earthquakes as a thing. All right. So who are our intellectual conversation partners? Well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? It's our friends, our graduate student and faculty friends in the university. It's Christian students. Why are we not having these conversations amongst our students in our graduate groups, if we are not? I gave a presentation to a Christian group a while ago in a fine research university, and I asked each of the students to go around and describe what was their current dissertation topic. And afterwards somebody came up to me and said, all the years I've been at this university, that's the first time I've ever talked in a Christian context about my discipline or my topic. Christian faculty, of course, I agree with Bob. There are hundreds of Christian faculty inside our universities, and they're hiding. And they're hiding for all sorts of reasons, but among the reasons they're hiding, as I know well myself, is that it's hard work to be pulled out of your office and to be pulled off your scholarly agenda and to be pulled out of your classroom and to think Christianly about something that's difficult to think Christianly about. But that's no excuse. And I actually think that part of the role of graduate students and part of the role of other faculty is to find those Christian faculty, but not only Christian faculty, as Bob again said, there are lots of non-Christian faculty who would be perfectly happy, indeed welcome, conversations with those of us who are people of faith, but who do it in a way that is appropriate to a conversation. And then, of course, other campus groups, not only religious groups, but groups that stand up for various kinds of issues. Let me give you two examples. A couple of years ago, my friend John Mulholland sent me an email and said, look, there's a big lecture coming up at the University of Chicago Law School on forgiveness. Do you want to go? I said, well, yes. A surprising topic. It turned out it was the dean of the Harvard Law School coming to this, giving this great endowed lecture at the University of Chicago. So along John and I went. She gave a superb lecture. She said that forgiveness she's been working on for 20 years. She's Jewish, but she sees it as something critical to legal thinking. What excited me most was that the first commentator was Martha Nussbaum, a distinguished legal political philosopher, Jewish. Martha spoke for 10 minutes. I would say that 5 of those 10 minutes were her explication of the parable of the prodigal son. A very, very sympathetic. In fact, she used the parable of the prodigal son as a way of encountering and to some extent critiquing what Martha Minow had said. Another example, a couple of my Christian academic friends at Northwestern said, wouldn't it be marvelous if we could bring this great biblical metaphor into open discussion across Northwestern's campus? And they said, let's have a 1.5, 2-day seminar on light. Brilliant concept, because they managed to bring together somebody from the medical school who was an ophthalmologist. They found an African anthropologist who was working on rain on light coming through the canopy of the rainforest. They found a person in the arts domain who was working on Orthodox Russian iconography and art and light in the iconography. They had a poet, and they had two biblical scholars and theologians. It was introduced by the president of the university. It was a conversation where Christians got to speak to a much wider audience than they normally do, in a gentle way, as gentle, I would say, as Paul was engaged in the Areopagus, joining conversations, but with a distinctive Christian point of view. Now this, for me, is the tough part. I can be academic, it's my day job, as we've said, but how do I think Christianly? I'm not trained as a theologian. Most of we academics are not trained as theologians, and so we run into what I call the asymmetry problem. We may be very highly qualified in a particularly narrow area in which we work, but we're singularly unqualified theologically. We have at best a Sunday school or a high school understanding of our theology. So you ask me to think Christianly about anti-money laundering, and I become catatonic for a moment because that's just a quick move that I can't make. How do we do it? As I've discussed some of these issues in various parts of the world, these are some of the ways in which people are thinking of proceeding with various topics. So some people say, well, why not focus on topics in the Beatitudes like mercy or peacekeeping that cut across certainly many of the disciplines of the university. I was at the United Nations on Friday talking about the UN Security Council, reform of the UN Security Council. There were 100 diplomats and others from 20, 50 countries talking about peacekeeping operations of the UN Security Council. Who is the Prince of Peace? Peacekeeping is something that we have so much to say about, and lots of people in the university are talking about it. The fruits of the Spirit, peace and self-control. One of my colleagues is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He's decided that childhood education is something economists should be thinking about. He says that one of the most critical determinants of life chances, economic life chances, is the degree of self-control a child learns before the age of 3. Here we have self-control as one of the fruits of the spirits. That's our topic as well. The theologies, of course, that we know so well, of creation, of reconciliation, of revelation, some of which is already in our packet. We need ways to tell and develop for students and faculty what these theologies mean, and therefore how they can encounter the topics we looked at before. The students in Northern California, as well as our workshops with faculty in the Ohio Valley and in the Midwest, talked about these themes that are, again, the themes that cut across the university, but also across our Bible. We know from Genesis 1 that our God is not only a God who creates beautiful things and loves beauty, but a God who is creative, and God has given all of us a creative gift, and the university is one of those places where creativity booms. Oppression is something that we think much about in today's world. We live in a world full of awesome things. Our God created an awesome world. It's a world that's concerned with justice. Inequality is one example of that. And it's also a world concerned with order, whether that order is in microbiology, or in astrophysics, or in politics, or in law. So I suggest to you, and I would love to see us think creatively about programming in our campuses in various parts of the world, about imagining a series each year that takes a given topic, it could be biological diversity, and then traces through that topic in a series of theological encounters with our great Christian themes of peace, or justice, or awe, or beauty. Or turn it around the other way. Take a topic like beauty, and let's run it through a series of disciplines that we know the students in our Christian group are working in. Beauty in the arts, beauty in science, microscience, macroscience, beauty in poetry. I just came yesterday from Princeton University, and I'm part of a most intriguing international activity called the International Panel on Social Progress. This is a group of scholars around the world, 250 scholars around the world, who said, well, if the International Panel for Climate Change can work together to think about how we might both understand the science and think about the future, why couldn't we think about the social ills of our world and imagine what social science might say and how we might make progress? Very different to the kind of things that I normally do, so I'm involved in a panel on international organizations and the role that they can play in change across the world. So in our debate at Princeton on Monday and Tuesday, one of the issues we kept coming back to was, what is social progress? Not a bad question. So I went to the chapter that's currently still being formed on the master values that these philosophers and others are telling us are potential social values. Aren't those our topics? Flourishing, esteem or dignity, reconciliation. Don't we follow a God of reconciliation? Charity, that's our word, charity. Basic needs, the law and the prophets constantly talk about the widows and the orphans and the migrants and making sure their basic needs are satisfied. Justice, it's impossible to read the Old Testament. That's perhaps its most frequently repeated word, or one of them. So throughout the university, here are the world's social scientists focused on the big topics of the 21st century, and they're using concepts that we can engage as Christians. And we can do it readily and conversationally. I had a very interesting experience at the All Africa conference a couple of years ago, from which I think that speech comes in the small booklet that was handed out, when 20 national movements like ours got together to talk about the future. And a Kenyan academic administrator, sort of like perhaps the equivalent of Denise, got up and she said something that has had me thinking ever since. She said, constantly student groups and faculty come into my office and they want money to do this, and they want rooms to do that, and they want administrative infrastructure to do some other thing. She said, I always say to them, what does your group give me? Give my institution? What do you contribute to the purposes of the university? Until she said that, I have to say that I had never, ever thought of that as a question that could be asked of a Christian group on campus. And so I've been thinking about what that might mean. We know that demands are changing for academics in many parts of the world, in the way in which they teach. I certainly know in my research area, the National Science Foundation demands that every time I complete a project, I write up that project in a way that communicates with broad publics and audiences, so people have some kind of a handle on it. We need to appeal to our alumni and to publics for support. So we need to know how to communicate. What would it be like if our Christian groups were not only learning to think Christianly, but were engaged in the process of developing skills in our groups which advance the purposes of the university at the same time as they advance our conversational capacity? What if we actually taught people how to make presentations that communicate with a broader audience? That's a critical skill for a graduate student or for a faculty member. I think that's one of the wonderful things about the Passion Talks that Wendy Quay and others have been developing in California and in other parts of the country. We'll have a seminar on those tomorrow. What about listening skills? As you know, academics are not the best possible people at listening. I skipped over academic pathologies, but since I rather like this little section, let me just mention academic pathologies. And you all will find these familiar. Some of us, I've heard, are self-preoccupied. Others of us love monologues. Many of us are stuck in the details of what we do, and we can't lift our horizons beyond those. I've even heard it said that many of us are pedants. which of course I don't believe. And then finally, and commonly, much and most of what we do is inaccessible to anybody other than a few specialists in and around us. So we need to learn how to present our work in ways that are acceptable to others. And one way we can do that is inside our Christian groups. So I'm trying to think out loud here, and I will appreciate conversations with all of you in our time together today and tomorrow. Can we think about our Christian groups doing a Christian work in the university by helping our students to learn to think critically, to learn to distill ideas and arguments that they are thinking about in a coherent way, to learn to present to generalist audiences, to learn to interview others. I would actually suggest to you that these are ways for us to deepen our faith, quite apart from having an impact on the university. A few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, a brilliant young economist came to our research institute for a job tour. Taught at Harvard, University of Chicago, great credentials. He sent us a paper ahead of time so we'd have a sense of what he was going to talk about. I found it virtually incomprehensible, and I thought to myself, this man is going to bomb. We're an interdisciplinary audience of philosophers and anthropologists and historians and psychologists and so on. He will completely miss the mark because we will not understand a word he's saying. This man came in and he started with a fantastic story about the Boston fire of 1872. Who knew that Boston had a fire in 1872? And then he went on in his presentation to first of all give us a big picture as to why that Boston fire actually opens up a problem that's common to cities across America and across the world in the past and in the present. He went further and he translated what he was talking about, his technical terms, into metaphors and language that we all could easily understand. He had some fabulous visuals of the fire and of the regulations that weren't met. He told marvelous stories about the firefighters and the difficulty of getting to put the fire out because ladders were too short. And he came up with a clear punchline that related this to economic theory, which he's trying to advance, and related it to many other multidisciplinary problems that those of us think about property rights are concerned about. This was a brilliant example to me of what, in a way, passion talks and other ways of communicating make possible, how to present. We've talked about listening. We need to teach people, I think, to listen for the problems that others are grappling with, to hear the emotion that they're expressing, to see what are the big divides and the big debates going on in their fields. A lot of my research is of this kind. I'm actually working on things I don't know too much about, and that's part of the adventure. But one of the things that I commonly ask is, explain in words of one syllable that I can understand why you're trying to create an international law on this problem. What are the big debates currently about how to solve that problem? And who is on one side of the debate or the other side of the debate? People can do this. They love to do it, actually. It's about their thing. And they love to do it to ignorant people, because it's a way of kind of spreading the word. And for me, very exciting. And then we can ask also people, we need to listen for handles to help us through the complexity of all these disciplines that most of us don't know anything about. And then there's questioning. We don't have time to talk enough about questioning. We tried a little experiment at our Northern California winter conference where we played around with these ideas of social skills as an intrinsic part of our Christian witness and preparation on campus. And as part of that, I asked Wendy if she could find 2 students that I could interview cold to try and demonstrate how interviewing could be used as a way to stimulate a conversation. And I don't know if she's trying to trip me up, but she found one student from Santa Cruz who was working on the materials of solar panels to produce more efficient light, a physicist. And the other student was working on Greek literature in the 5th or 6th century BC. And so I interviewed both of these people in front of the audience to try and get a sense of what they're about. Two things were really notable about that. As the interview got going, you could hear the excitement mounting in the persons who were responding. I was in their field. I was taking seriously their problem, the very kind of thing they're striving for day and night. And so you could hear the emotional level rise. And I think everybody else in the room, including me, found it remarkable that solar panels can be such interesting things, and that poetry from the 4th or 5th century BC actually is something that we want to encounter. Very exciting. Why can't we do things like that systematically in our Christian groups? That was the slide that I was going to tell you about. Let me conclude. I'm raising here a series of questions, a puzzle, about how we can relate more fully to the heart, the core, the teaching core, the research core of the university. Not only in the United States, but my burden is about around the world. I leave two questions with us to consider. One of them, most of my experience is in research universities, so a very narrow slice of higher education and its many manifestations. Does anything about this conversational approach to mission in the university relate to commuter schools, as some faculty in the faculty symposium recently raised, or to online education, or to institutions that exist, it seems, only for credentialing, for night schools or weekend schools, where people are so busy, they rush in, they do their work, they do their course, they sit their exams, and then they leave. Does this make any sense? Any of this make any sense in those contexts? And my second question is a question for us. Are there ways in which we can imagine our roles to embrace some of the issues that we've been discussing this morning? It's tough because most of us don't have advanced qualifications in the fields that most of the grad students and faculty are working in. It's tough because many of us don't have the ultimate qualifications of the university. So how can we manage? I'll suggest to you that we can manage by empowering our students to talk and to talk to each other and to us. We can do it by dragging those faculty out of their offices and insisting that they talk to us in ways that we can understand, which is both benefiting them and benefiting us. That we recruit old men and old women, semi-retired and retired professors, and give them a new vision of this next chapter of their life as a way of engaging the university. I think this has us all stepping out of our comfort zones, doing things we haven't done before, or not very well, or not very completely before. But what a glorious challenge. Too often I think we've been irrelevant and marginal to the university in which we say we're serving. We haven't even learnt the language. We're disengaged from the center of the lives of the people to whom we're ministering. I believe that we must find new ways to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ, the emancipating, liberating gospel of Jesus Christ, to the campus of the universities. And I suggest one way that we might explore doing it is through having conversations engaging the university. Thank you.